December 7th, 1941, the date that would live in infamy, found Henry Hank Garrison elbow-deep in a water pump assembly at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, utterly unaware that his entire world was about to shatter. The 23-year-old machinist had spent the last 4 years crafting pumps for merchant vessels, his calloused hands shaping metal with the precision of a sculptor. When the radio crackled to life that Sunday afternoon with news of Pearl Harbor, Hank set down his wrench with a quiet determination that his supervisor would later describe as chilling in its certainty. Within 48 hours, he had enlisted in the United States Navy, trading his coveralls for dress whites, his toolbox for a weapon he had never fired. The recruitment officer had barely glanced at his application. "Can you follow orders?" the man asked, his eyes already scanning the next form in an endless pile of patriotic volunteers. Hank nodded. What the officer didn't ask what nobody thought to ask was whether a pump maker possessed the split-second reflexes. The predatory instinct, the cold calculation required to kill another human being at 20,000 feet. The Navy needed bodies to fill bombers, and Hank Garrison's body would do just fine. By March of 1942, aviation machinist, mate 3rd class, Henry Garrison found himself strapped into the cramped tailgunner position of a Douglas TBD Devastator. Somewhere over the impossibly blue waters of the Coral Sea, his training had been abbreviated, rushed, almost comically insufficient. 3 weeks of gunnery school in Florida, where he'd fired perhaps 2,000 rounds total at fabric sleeves towed by worn-out biplanes. His instructors had praised his natural feel for deflection shooting, but Hank knew the truth. He was simply applying the same spatial geometry he'd used for years when fitting pump housings into engine compartments. Lead the target, account for relative motion, squeeze smoothly, metal to metal, whether you're installing a valve or sending bullets through aluminum skin. The mission briefing that morning had been terse. Commander Wallace, a career officer whose hands trembled slightly from too many cigarettes and too little sleep, had traced their route across a salt-stained map with one tobacco-stained finger. Reconnaissance sweep, Sector 47. Intelligence suggests enemy carrier activity. Stay sharp. Stay alive. According to naval records documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, published in 1949, this particular sweep was considered routine a standard patrol in what was rapidly becoming a contested maritime battlefield. Hank had loaded his twin Browning .50 caliber machine guns with the methodical care of a man who understood machinery. Each belt of ammunition represented 250 rounds of copper-jacketed death, and he had 4 belts within arm's reach, 1,000 rounds between him and whatever hell awaited in the sky. His pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Bobby Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, had twisted around in his cockpit to offer Hank a thumbs-up and a grin that seemed far too confident for a man about to fly into potential combat. Their bombardier navigator, Ensign Michael Kowalski, a former accountant from Pittsburgh, was busy double-checking coordinates and muttering calculations under his breath. As their Devastator lifted from the carrier deck, the USS Lexington, that massive floating city of steel and determination, Hank pressed his face against the small window of his turret and watched the ship shrink beneath them. Somewhere in his chest, beneath a standard-issue flight suit and the bulky Mae West life preserver, his heart hammered against his ribs like a piston in an overheated engine. He was a pump maker, a machinist, a kid from Philadelphia who'd never fired a gun in anger, never seen combat, never killed anything larger than the rats that occasionally infested the Navy Yard workshops. In 15 minutes, Henry Garrison would become something else entirely. The Devastator droned eastward through air so smooth it felt like flying through silk. The 3-man crew settling into that peculiar combination of boredom and hypervigilance that characterized military aviation. Hank rotated his turret through its full range of motion for the dozenth time, hydraulics whining softly, his gloved hands resting on the twin butterfly triggers of his Brownings. Below, the Coral Sea spread in every direction like hammered pewter, occasionally broken by white caps that from this altitude looked no larger than grains of rice. The monotony was hypnotic, dangerous. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled through the intercom system, tinny and distorted by static. "Garrison, you still awake back there? How much of a show today?" Hank keyed his microphone twice in acknowledgement the informal yes that aviators had adopted to conserve radio chatter. His eyes, however, never stopped scanning the horizon. quartering the sky in the systematic pattern his instructors had drilled into him during those abbreviated weeks of training. High right, high left, low right, low left. Check 6 o'clock. Repeat. High right, high left, low right, low left. Check 6 o'clock. Repeat. Ensign Kowalski interrupted the silence with coordinates, his accountant's precision undiminished by the circumstances. Coming up on waypoint Charlie in 5 minutes. Still nothing on the scope. The Devastator carried primitive radar equipment. It's barely more sophisticated than a child's toy by modern standards, but it was the cutting edge of 1942 technology. If enemy ships were out here, the scope would show them as fuzzy green blobs against a darker green background. So far, nothing but empty ocean. What none of them knew, what nobody could have known, was that 8 Japanese Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters had departed from the carrier Shoho 90 minutes earlier with orders to intercept any American reconnaissance aircraft operating in this sector. The Japanese pilots were veterans, men who had flown over China, men who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, men whose combined flight hours numbered in the thousands. They approached from the northeast, maintaining radio silence, using the sun's glare as camouflage. Their leader, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 28-year-old ace with 11 confirmed kills, had positioned his formation perfectly for what should have been a simple ambush of an outdated American torpedo bomber. Hank saw them first. Not because he was particularly skilled or exceptionally alert, but because at that precise moment, 10:47 in the morning, ship's time, he happened to be scanning the high right quadrant when sunlight glinted off a canopy at approximately 22,000 feet. For one heartbeat, then another, his brain refused to process what his eyes were reporting. Birds. Seabirds didn't fly at that altitude. Debris impossible. And then the objects resolved into their true forms. Aircraft, multiple aircraft, diving fast and hard with the unmistakable intent of men coming to kill. Bandits. Bandits high right, 8 o'clock position, coming fast. His voice surprised him with its steadiness, the Philadelphia accent flattened by adrenaline into something mechanical and cold. Lieutenant Chen didn't waste time on questions or confirmation. The Devastator's nose dropped sharply as he shoved the stick forward, simultaneously banking left and descending, trying to gain airspeed, trying to present a more difficult target. The bomber groaned under the stress, rivets popping in the wings, the whole airframe shuddering like a frightened animal. But torpedo bombers weren't built for evasive maneuvers. The TBD Devastator had a maximum speed of barely 200 miles per hour, and that was in level flight under ideal conditions. Diving zero could exceed 330 miles per hour. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The Japanese fighters would close the distance in less than 2 minutes. It's probably less than 90 seconds. Hank swiveled his turret around, tracking the lead aircraft as it grew from a distant speck to a recognizable shape, the distinctive red circles on its wings visible now, the rising sun emblem that would haunt American nightmares for the next 4 years. His training evaporated like morning dew. Every classroom lesson, every range session, every instructor's advice simply vanished. Replaced by something older and more fundamental, the animal knowledge that comes when death approaches at 300 miles per hour. His hands found the triggers without conscious thought. His thumbs flipped the safety switches. The turret's hydraulics whined as he tracked the lead zero, which had pulled out of its dive and was now approaching from their 7 o'clock position, lining up for what would surely be a killing shot on the Devastator's engine. Later, psychiatrists studying combat stress would identify what happened next as a dissociative episode, a psychological state where the conscious mind steps back and allows deeper, more primitive brain structures to take control. Hank would remember none of his thoughts during those 15 minutes. Only sensations, the vibration of the guns, the smell of cordite, the way empty brass casings clinked against the turret walls like distant wind chimes. But in that moment, as the first zero closed to 800 yards, then 600, then 400, Henry Garrison, the pump maker, ceased to exist. And something else squeezed the triggers. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun. When properly maintained and loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, fires at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute per barrel. Hank's twin-mount configuration meant 1,600 rounds per minute roughly. 27 bullets every second, each projectile weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When he pressed the triggers, the physical effect was immediate and visceral. The entire turret shook with mechanical violence, the guns hammering against their mounts, the vibration traveling up through his arms and into his chest until his teeth rattled and his vision blurred. The tracers, every fifth round loaded with phosphorus that ignited from barrel. Friction arced through the sky like deadly orange fireflies, creating a visible stream that allowed him to adjust his aim. His first burst went wide, passing harmlessly ahead of the lead Zero as Hank overcorrected for deflection. 2 seconds wasted. The Japanese pilot, seeing the tracers, jinked left and then right, a maneuver designed to spoil the gunner's solution. But the movement was predictable, textbook, exactly what Hank's instructors had warned them to expect. Instead of tracking the aircraft's current position, he walked his fire to where the Zero would be in the next half-second, leading the target by an additional 20 feet. The second burst connected. Hank actually saw with his own eyes, though he would later doubt this memory, the bullet stitch across the Zero's right wing root, punching through the thin aluminum skin like nails through cardboard. One round, perhaps two, found the fuel tank located just behind the engine. The Mitsubishi A6M was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering, stripped of every unnecessary ounce of weight to achieve its legendary maneuverability. That included armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. When the incendiary rounds ignited the high-octane aviation fuel, the result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Zero transformed from an aircraft into a fireball in less time than it takes to blink. One moment, a sleek fighter bearing down for the kill. The next, an orange and black flower of flame blossoming against the blue sky. Hank saw the pilot, or perhaps imagined he saw the pilot silhouetted briefly against the flames before the aircraft tumbled away, trailing black smoke and burning debris. There was no parachute. Japanese military doctrine discouraged retreat, even when retreat meant the difference between death and survival. Lieutenant Yamamoto, 11 victories to his name, became Hank Garrison's first kill at precisely 10:48 and 32 seconds. There was no time to process this, no opportunity for reflection or horror or triumph. The remaining 7 Zeros had scattered their formation, adapting instantly to this unexpected resistance. 2 broke left, 2 broke right, 3 continued strata scissors maneuver, designed to overwhelm a single gunner with multiple threat vectors simultaneously. Lieutenant Chen was screaming something into the intercom. Words lost in static and the hammering roar of Hank's guns, the Devastator corkscrewing through the sky in desperate evasive turns that should have torn the elderly airframe apart. Hank swung his turret hard left. Ignoring the 3 Zeros approaching from the right, they were Bobby Chun's problem now. The pilot's job to keep them from getting a clean shot, and focused on the 2 aircraft diving from above. Lead and lag. Lead and lag. The mantra from gunnery school surfaced through the adrenaline fog. These pilots were smarter, more cautious, after seeing their leader explode. They came in from different angles, forcing Hank to choose which threat to address first. He chose wrong, tracking the higher aircraft while the lower Zero pulled into firing position. 20mm cannon shells walked up the Devastator's fuselage, punching fist-sized holes in the thin aluminum, one round passing so close to Hank's turret that he felt the pressure wave and smelled the explosive residue. But the Japanese pilot had made his own mistake. He'd flown too close, too confident, probably expecting the American gunner to be dead or at least suppressed by the cannon fire. At a range of barely 200 yards, Hank couldn't miss. He simply pointed the turret at the Zero's engine cowling and held the triggers down. Walking the tracers straight through the aircraft's center of mass, the radial engine seized immediately, pistons and cylinders destroyed by armor-piercing rounds, and the Zero went from 300 miles per hour to 0 in the time it took gravity to convert forward momentum into an uncontrolled tumble. This pilot did try to bail out. Hank saw him jettison the canopy, but at that altitude and that airspeed, the slipstream simply smashed him against his own fuselage. The Zero and its pilot plunged together toward the sea below. 2 down. 6 to go. Hank's ammunition counter showed he'd already expended 400 rounds, nearly a full belt. His arms ached from controlling the shuddering guns, his shoulders screaming protests from the recoil forces. Through the turret's small windows, the sky had become a confused tangle of aircraft. Smoke trails, tracer rounds, and spent brass casings glittering in the sunlight as they tumbled away from his turret. Somewhere in his mind, the part still capable of coherent thought noted absurdly that he'd never properly thanked his supervisor at the Navy Yard for teaching him about mechanical timing and synchronization. Because that's all this was, really. It's just machines, moving through space, following predictable paths governed by physics and engineering limitations. And Henry Garrison understood machines better than most men understood their own families. The human brain, when functioning under extreme stress, processes time differently than during normal consciousness. Neuroscientists would later term this tachypsychia, a perceptual distortion where seconds seem to stretch into minutes, allowing the mind to observe and react with what appears to be superhuman speed. For Hank, trapped in his turret while 7 enemy fighters tried to kill him, the remaining 13 minutes of combat felt like hours, each moment crystal clear and hyper-detailed, as though someone had slowed the film reel of reality to 1/4 speed. The third Zero died because its pilot hesitated. This Japanese aviator whose name Hank would never learn, whose family in Osaka would receive only a terse telegram about an honorable death in service to the second Emperor, approached from below and behind, climbing to match the Devastator's altitude. It was a patient, professional approach, textbook tactics that should have resulted in an easy kill. But when the pilot reached firing position, he paused for perhaps 2 seconds, possibly adjusting his gun sight, possibly ensuring his angle of attack was perfect, possibly just taking one extra breath before committing to the kill. 2 seconds was enough. Hank, who had swiveled his turret to track a different threat, caught the movement in his peripheral vision and spun back with a speed that surprised even him. The hydraulics screamed under the sudden demand, and for one terrible moment, he thought he'd burned out the motor. But the turret completed its rotation, bringing the twin Brownings to bear, just as the Japanese pilot squeezed his own triggers. They fired simultaneously, the Zero's 20mm cannons and Hank's 50 caliber machine guns, and for a frozen instant, the space between the two aircraft filled with crisscrossing streams of metal death. The Japanese rounds missed, not by much. Hank felt the Devastator shudder as shells passed underneath the fuselage, but in aerial combat, a miss was as good as a mile. Hank's rounds didn't miss. The convergence pattern at that range meant both streams of fire intersected directly through the Zero's cockpit. The result wasn't dramatic or cinematic. The fighter simply stopped flying, its pilot killed instantly, and began a gentle, almost peaceful glide toward the ocean, already a tomb for its occupant. 3 down. 5 remaining. But Hank's second ammunition belt was running dry, and his water cooling system was overheating, steam beginning to vent from the jacket barrels. If the guns seized from thermal expansion, he'd be defenseless. He released the triggers, letting the barrels cool for 5 precious seconds, 5 seconds during which a fourth Zero made its attack run, and Lieutenant Chen threw the Devastator into a turn so violent that Hank's vision grayed at the edges from G-forces. The Japanese pilot's rounds went wide, striking empty air where the American bomber had been moments before. According to post-war interviews documented in the 1953 publication, The First Team by naval historian John Lundstrom, Zero pilots at this stage of the war had developed a dangerous overconfidence born from months of easy victories against obsolete Allied aircraft. They had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that even a mediocre gunner could kill you if you made a mistake, and that every mistake in aerial combat was potentially fatal. The fourth Zero to die that morning made its fatal error when its pilot decided to showboat, executing a slow victory roll after what he believed was a successful strafing run on the crippled Devastator. The roll exposed the Zero's underside, the one area where even its minimal armor plating was thinnest for nearly 3 full seconds. Hank had just slapped a fresh belt into his guns, his movements automatic now, muscle memory taking over while his conscious mind observed from some distant, detached place. He tracked the rolling fighter, waited for the perfect moment when the aircraft's belly was fully exposed, and fired a single, sustained burst of approximately 75 rounds. Half of them missed. The other half turned the Zero's fuselage into a sieve, destroying the engine oil lines, the hydraulic systems, and quite possibly the pilot himself. The fighter didn't explode this time. It simply fell out of the sky like a wounded bird, smoke pouring from its engine, the propeller windmilling uselessly as it descended toward the sea. Hank watched it fall, watched it splash into the ocean, leaving a white circle of foam that was visible for perhaps 10 seconds before the waves erased all evidence that a man had just died there. For to go. But the remaining Japanese pilots had learned They stopped approaching individually, stopped giving Hank single targets to focus on. Instead, they coordinated their attacks, coming in pairs from opposite directions, forcing him to choose which threat to address while the other lined up for an unmolested shot. It was the correct tactic. The only tactic that made sense against a defender who had just killed 4 of their comrades in less than 10 minutes. It should have worked. It didn't work because Ensign Kowalski, the accountant from Pittsburgh, who had spent the entire battle thus far hunched over his navigation station, trying not to vomit from the violent maneuvers, finally found his courage, grabbed the single .30 caliber machine gun mounted in the Devastator's nose, a weapon so inadequate it was almost. Deckard Van began firing at the Zeros attacking from the forward quarter. He couldn't hit anything at that range with that weapon, but he didn't need to hit anything. Just needed to disrupt the attackers' concentration, make them flinch, spoil their aim for the crucial half-second that Hank needed to bring his own guns to bear. The 5th Zero died because its pilot flinched. Kowalski's tracers streamed past his canopy, harmless but psychologically effective. And the pilot broke off his attack run 2 seconds early, turning away to avoid what he perceived as concentrated defensive fire. The turn exposed his aircraft's profile to Hank's turret, and Hank operating now on pure instinct. His conscious mind having completely surrendered control to whatever primal, predatory thing lurked in his hindbrain, didn't hesitate. Another burst, another 70 or 80 rounds, and another Zero fell burning into the Coral Sea. 5 kills. 8 minutes elapsed. And Henry Garrison, the pump maker from Philadelphia, was just getting started. The human body can only sustain combat intensity for so long before it begins to fail in ways both obvious and subtle. Hank's hands had gone numb from the constant vibration of the guns, his shoulders screaming in protest from fighting the recoil, his neck muscles rigid as iron from the sustained tension of tracking targets. Through the limited field of view offered by his turret, sweat poured down his face despite the freezing air at 10,000 feet, soaking through his flight suit, his gloves slippery inside against the triggers. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Peripheral awareness collapsed to nothing but the crosshairs of his gun sight, and the aircraft trying to enter those crosshairs. The 6th Zero almost killed them. Its pilot later identified as Petty Officer First Class Saburo Nakamura, a veteran of the China campaigns with 8 confirmed victories, executed a perfect overhead attack that should have been impossible to defend against. He approached from directly behind and above the sun, invisible against the glare, his engine throttled back to reduce noise, descending like a falcon upon a pigeon. By the time Hank spotted him, Nakamura was already in his firing run, already squeezing his triggers, already certain of his kill. What saved them was luck, pure and simple. Though Lieutenant Chen would later insist it was skill, and Hank would never speak of it at all. The Devastator hit an Air Paqueta's sudden downdraft caused by thermal instability and dropped approximately 50 feet in less than 2 seconds. Nakamura's cannon shells, aimed perfectly at where the bomber had been, passed through empty air inches above the fuselage. And in the 3 seconds it took the Japanese pilot to adjust his aim and fire again, Hank rotated his turret upward, a movement that should have been impossible given the mechanical stops installed to prevent gunners from shooting their own aircraft, and somehow impossibly brought his guns to bear on the Zero diving from above. He never knew how he managed it. The turret's range of motion shouldn't have allowed that angle of fire. Perhaps the violent maneuvering had bent something in the mounting bracket, or perhaps adrenaline had simply given him the strength to force the mechanism beyond its design limitations. Whatever the reason, the Brownings roared, tracers climbing vertically through the sky, and Nakamura, surprised, undoubtedly shocked to be taking fire from an angle he'd believed was a blind spot, jerked his stick reflexively, breaking off his attack. The defensive maneuver saved his life for approximately 4 seconds. Hank tracked him through the turn, led him perfectly, and fired again. This burst was different from the others, more controlled, more precise, almost surgical. 50 rounds, maybe 60, walking up the Zero's left wing from route to tip, severing aileron cables and shredding the control surfaces. Nakamura's fighter rolled uncontrollably to the left, and though the pilot fought his stick with desperate strength, the physics were unforgiving. The Zero entered a flat spin, rotating like a falling leaf, and impacted the ocean at nearly 300 miles per hour. The explosion was small and distant, barely visible from the Devastator's altitude, just a brief white splash against the darker blue of the sea. 6 kills. 11 minutes elapsed. 3 Zeros remained, but the psychological balance had shifted dramatically. The Japanese pilots, who had begun this engagement with the casual confidence of predators attacking prey, now circled the Devastator at a wary distance, like wolves who'd discovered their wounded caribou carried a concealed knife. They were veterans, professionals, men who had survived dozens of combat missions by knowing when to press an attack and when to exercise caution. The burning wrecks of 6 of their companions argued strongly for caution. But they were also Japanese naval aviators in the spring of 1942, serving an empire that valued honor and sacrifice above survival, trained in a military culture where retreat was virtually synonymous with cowardice. The 3 remaining pilots whose names would never be recorded, whose deaths would be noted only as losses due to combat operations in the after-action reports, chose honor over survival. They regrouped at a distance of approximately 2 miles, formed a loose V formation, and began their final attack run simultaneously from 3 different vectors. It was a suicide tactic, and all 3 pilots almost certainly knew it. At least one of them would survive long enough to reach firing position, but the other 2 would likely die in the attempt. For samurai warriors wearing flight suits instead of swords, this was an acceptable exchange. For Henry Garrison, it was a shooting gallery. The 7th Zero died first, not because Hank chose it as his primary target, but because its pilot was the most aggressive. Closing the distance faster than his companions, apparently determined to ram the Devastator if his ammunition ran out. This berserker approach would have been effective against a panicking, poorly trained gunner, against Hank, who by this point had achieved a state of cold mechanical efficiency that would have frightened anyone who saw his face. It was simply suicide with extra steps. Hank waited until the Zero reached 400 yards. It's close enough that he could see the pilot's white scarf streaming behind his headrest, close enough to distinguish individual panel lines in the fighter's aluminum skin. Then he fired, not a burst, but a sustained stream of fire that lasted nearly 5 full seconds and expended close to 200 rounds. At that range, the probability of hit was nearly 100%. The Zero absorbed perhaps 30 or 40 direct impacts before something critical failed. Probably the engine, possibly the pilot himself, and the fighter nosed down abruptly, diving nearly vertically toward the ocean below. Hank never saw it hit the water. He was already tracking the 8th target, his turret swiveling left with a scream of tortured hydraulics, his ammunition counter showing less than 100 rounds remaining in his final belt. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in that distant observer's place where his conscious thoughts had retreated, he registered this information with clinical detachment. 100 rounds. Enough for 1 extended burst, maybe 2 short ones. And 2 enemy fighters still alive, still attacking, still fully capable of killing him and his crew. The mathematics were simple and brutal. He would run out of ammunition before he ran out of targets, which meant the next 30 seconds would determine whether he lived or died. Time stretched like taffy, each second expanding into impossible length as Hank's turret tracked the 8th Zero through a climbing turn that should have taken it out of his firing arc. The Japanese pilot was executing a perfect lag displacement roller maneuver designed to throw off a gunner's aim while maintaining offensive positioning, and under normal circumstances, it would have worked flawlessly. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Hank was no longer operating under anything resembling normal human cognition. His vision had contracted to almost nothing now, peripheral awareness completely gone, conscious thought reduced to a single repeating calculation: angle, distance, deflection, lead. Angle, distance, deflection, lead. The turret's motors whined in protest as he swung it through its maximum traverse rate, his hands moving with the precision he'd once applied to calibrating pump tolerances to within thousandths of an inch. The Zero rolled right, Hank led right. The Zero snapped left, Hank's tracers followed left. For 3 full seconds, they danced this deadly ballet, the Japanese pilot desperately trying to shake his pursuer, Hank mechanically, relentlessly, maintaining his firing solution. The pilot made his fatal error when he committed fully to his escape maneuver, pushing his stick forward into a splittist dive that would have taken him safely away from the Devastator's defensive envelope. For 1 full second, 1 eternal, stretched out second, the Zero's profile was perfectly perpendicular to Hank's gun sight, presenting its maximum surface area, every vulnerable system exposed. Hank fired his penultimate burst, 43 rounds according to the ammunition counter, and watched with detached clarity as the tracers converged on the Zero's fuselage just aft of the cockpit. This pilot was luckier than his 7 dead companions. The rounds that hit his aircraft damaged critical systems controls. Hydraulics, possibly fuel lines, but didn't immediately ignite a fire or destroy the engine. The Zero fell away trailing smoke, its pilot fighting for control, gradually pulling out of its dive at dangerously low altitude. Whether he eventually made it back to the Shoho, whether he died attempting a water landing, whether he nursed his crippled fighter to some remote island and survived the war, Hank would never know, would never seek to know, would spend the rest of his life actively avoiding any knowledge of the men he'd killed or crippled on this one particular morning in the Coral Sea. 1-0 remained. One aircraft, one pilot, one final threat between Henry Garrison and survival, and approximately 57 rounds of ammunition in his guns. According to the counter that he couldn't stop staring at between tracking movements, 57 chances to get this right, after which he would be defenseless, reduced to watching helplessly while a Japanese fighter killed him and his crewmates with leisurely, unmolested precision. The final Japanese pilot had watched 7 of his companions die or fall from the sky in less than 13 minutes. This experience had taught him something important. The American gunner in that obsolete torpedo bomber was not a normal adversary. Normal gunners panicked, fired wildly, wasted ammunition. This gunner was calm, methodical, efficient. He fired only when he had a solution, and when he fired, people died. The proper tactical response was obvious. Maintain distance, wait for the gunner to expend his remaining ammunition, then close for the kill at leisure. It was the correct decision, the only logical decision, the decision that should have guaranteed the Japanese pilot's survival and the Devastator's destruction. But logic and survival instinct apparently couldn't override the deeper cultural programming. The Bushido code that made retreat unthinkable even when retreat was tactically sound. Or perhaps the pilot simply couldn't bear to return to the Shoho and report that he'd survived while 8 of his companions had died. Whatever his reasoning, he elected to attack. He approached from the Devastator's 11 o'clock position, slightly above, angling for a high deflection shot that would be difficult for a turret gunner to track. It was a good approach, professional and well executed, giving Hank barely 3 seconds to acquire the target, calculate the lead, and fire. 3 seconds to expend his final 57 rounds. 3 seconds to decide whether he would see tomorrow. Later, much later, during the mandatory psychological evaluation that followed this mission, Hank would tell the Navy psychiatrist that he couldn't remember pulling the triggers that final time. He remembered tracking the target, remembered the turret swinging smoothly through its arc, remembered the familiar vibration building in his arms as the guns prepared to fire. Then there was a gap in his memory, a blank space perhaps 4 or 5 seconds long, and when his awareness returned he was staring at an empty sky, his guns silent, the ammunition counter reading exactly 0. The 9th 0 because despite the 8 aircraft formation that had jumped them, somehow a 9th fighter had joined the melee at some point, though nobody could later explain when or from where was spinning toward the ocean, smoke pouring from its shattered engine cowling. Hank watched it fall with the same detached curiosity he might have applied to observing an interesting gear mechanism. His mind noting the rate of rotation, the angle of descent, the way pieces of debris separated from the main body during its final plunge, and then, quite suddenly, the sky was empty. No fighters, no tracers, no engine noise, except the Devastator's own laboring radial engine. Just blue sky, white clouds, and the infinite expanse of the Coral Sea below. The silence in his headset was so profound it seemed loud, a roaring absence of sound that pressed against his eardrums like physical pressure. Lieutenant Chen's voice, when it finally crackled through the intercom, sounded like it was coming from another universe entirely. "Garrison? Garrison? You still with us back there?" Hank tried to respond, tried to key his microphone, and confirm that yes, he was alive. Yes, he was functional. Yes, they could return to the Lexington now. But his hands wouldn't cooperate. His fingers frozen in a death grip on the triggers of guns that no longer had ammunition to fire. 14 minutes and approximately 37 seconds had elapsed since he'd first spotted the enemy formation. 7 confirmed kills, 1 probable, 1 damaged. 1 pump maker from Philadelphia transformed into something else entirely. Something he didn't have words for and wouldn't want to name even if he did. The flight back to the USS Lexington took 43 minutes. each one longer than the previous. Time gradually resuming its normal pace as Hank's body began to register what his mind had refused to acknowledge during combat. His hands trembled uncontrollably now, muscles spasming from sustained tension and adrenaline overload. His shoulders felt as though someone had inserted hot iron rods directly into the joints, the pain so intense that even breathing hurt. When he finally unclenched his jaw, he discovered he'd bitten through the rubber mouthpiece of his radio set without noticing, the taste of blood and rubber mixing unpleasantly on his tongue. The Devastator hadn't escaped unscathed. Lieutenant Chen nursed the damaged bomber back toward the carrier, with the careful attention of a surgeon repairing a critical patient, constantly adjusting trim and throttle to compensate for damaged control surfaces, and a dozen holes punched through their airframe by Japanese cannon shells. One round had passed through the fuselage less than 18 inches from Hank's turret, close enough that he could smell the explosive residue every time the wind shifted. Another had destroyed their radio antenna, severing their communication with the Lexington. They were flying home in radio silence, hoping their carrier would still be where they'd left it, hoping they'd have enough fuel to reach her, hoping their damaged landing gear would deploy when needed. Ensign Kowalski had crawled back from his navigator's station to check on Hank, his accountant's face pale and drawn, his hands still shaking from his own first experience with combat. He took one look at Hankat, his white-knuckled grip on the triggers, his 1,000-yard stare, his rigid posture that suggested he'd been carved from ice, and simply placed one hand on Hank's shoulder without speaking. There were no words for what they'd just experienced, no vocabulary adequate to describe the transformation of three ordinary men into survivors of something extraordinary and terrible. The Lexington appeared on the horizon at 11:47, her distinctive silhouette unmistakable even at a distance of 20 miles. The massive carrier was steaming in a defensive circle with her escorts, the entire task force alert for further Japanese attacks. As the Devastator approached, Hank could see other aircraft circling in landing patterns, could see the organized chaos of a carrier deck preparing to recover its birds. Everything looked impossibly normal, impossibly routine, as though the universe hadn't just fundamentally changed in the span of 15 minutes. Lieutenant Chen brought them in for landing with the steady hands of a man who'd aged 10 years in the past hour. The Devastator's damaged landing gear held barely as they trapped the third wire and jerked to a violent stop on the carrier deck. Deck crews swarmed immediately, seeing the battle damage, rushing to secure the aircraft and assist the crew. Hank sat motionless in his turret, unable to process the need to move, to unbuckle, to climb out. Someone had to physically help him from his position, his legs refusing to support his weight, his hands still locked in their death grip. The carrier's medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Harrison Phillips, soft-spoken man from Georgia, who'd treated everything from appendicitis to shrapnel wounds, took one look at Hank and immediately ordered him to sickbay. But before they could lead him away, Commander Wallace appeared. The same officer who'd given them their briefing that morning, though that briefing felt like it had occurred in another lifetime, two different people in a different universe. Wallace's hands still trembled from too many cigarettes, but his eyes were sharp and calculating as he surveyed the shot-up Devastator. "How many?" Wallace asked quietly, directing his question at Lieutenant Chen, who was being helped from his cockpit by a crew chief. "How many did you get?" Chen looked at his commander, then back at Hank, then at the turret position that still reeked of cordite and hot metal. "I don't know, sir. I was too busy flying. But Garrison was firing non-stop for... God, it must have been 10 or 15 minutes straight. I saw at least 4 zeros go down, maybe 5. Ensign Kowalski, standing nearby with a deck officer's clipboard, cleared his throat. With accountant's precision, which had served him so well in his previous life, adding columns of numbers in a Pittsburgh office, now manifested in careful observation and accurate counting. 7 confirmed, sir. I watched them. 7 aircraft destroyed, 1 probably destroyed, 1 damaged. In 14 minutes and 37 seconds, according to my mission timer." He paused, his voice dropping to something like awe. "He killed 7 of them. On his first combat mission. Well, with a tail gun." The deck fell silent. Other pilots and aircrew, hearing Kowalski's report, stopped what they were doing to stare at the pump maker from Philadelphia who stood swaying on the deck. His flight suit soaked with sweat, his face gray with exhaustion, his eyes focused on something 1,000 miles away. Someone began to clap slowly, deliberately, and then others joined until the flight deck echoed with applause that seemed to embarrass Hank more than the combat had frightened him. Commander Wallace studied Hank for a long moment, his experienced eyes recognizing something in the young machinist's face that he'd seen before in other men who'd crossed certain lines, who'd done certain things, who discovered capabilities within themselves that couldn't be undiscovered. "Get him to sickbay," Wallace ordered quietly. "Full examination, and keep him under observation for 24 hours. Then I want a complete debriefing." He paused, then added something that wasn't standard procedure. "And someone find out what kind of pumps he used to make. I want to know what kind of precision training produces shooting like that." As they led Hank toward the carrier's interior, toward the clean white walls of the medical bay, and the questions that would inevitably follow, he turned back once to look at his turret. The twin Brownings were still smoking slightly, heat waves shimmering from the barrels. Empty brass casings littered the deck around the turret mount, glinting in the Pacific sunlight like scattered gold. Someone would collect them, count them, verify Kowalski's accounting. Someone would examine the guns, write reports, try to understand how one gunner had achieved what should have been impossible. But Hank already knew the answer, though he would never articulate it clearly. It's not to the debriefers, not to the psychiatrists, not even to himself during the long nights that would follow. The answer was simple. Machines were predictable. Pumps, aircraft, engines, they all followed rules, physics, mathematical certainties. You learned the rules, you understood the tolerances, you calculated the timing. Whether you were fitting a valve housing or leading a target, the principle was identical. Metal to metal, cause to effect, action to reaction. The only difference was that when you miscalculated pump tolerances, you got a leak. When you miscalculated deflection shooting, men died burning in the sky or drowning in the Coral Sea. The mathematics were the same. The consequences were somewhat different. The story of Henry Garrison's 15 minutes over the Coral Sea spread through the Pacific Fleet with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. By evening of that same day, December 7th, 1942, every ship in Task Force 17 had heard some version of the tale, each retelling adding embellishments that Hank himself would have been unable to confirm or deny. By week's end, the story had reached Pearl Harbor, where it was seized upon by Navy public relations officers desperate for good news to counter the steady drumbeat of Japanese victories across the Pacific. By month's end, newspapers across America carried headlines proclaiming pump maker becomes ace in single mission and Philadelphia machinist down 7 zeros. The Navy, recognizing the propaganda value of Hank's achievement, awarded him the Navy Cross in a ceremony aboard the Lexington 3 weeks after the engagement. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself pinned the medal to Hank's dress uniform while photographers captured the moment for posterity. The flashbulbs popping like miniature stars. Citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession as turret gunner aboard a Devastator torpedo bomber during action against enemy Japanese forces. Aviation machinists made third-class Garrison, with complete disregard for his own safety and demonstrating exceptional gunnery skill, destroyed 7 enemy aircraft and damaged 2 others. ... What the citation didn't mention what couldn't be mentioned in official documents or newspaper accounts was that Henry Garrison had changed fundamentally during those 14 minutes over the Coral Sea. The man who received the Navy Cross was not the same man who had enlisted 9 months earlier with patriotic fervor and naive enthusiasm. His eyes held a distance now, a quality that other combat veterans recognized immediately, but that civilians found unsettling and incomprehensible. He smiled when appropriate, shook hands when required, said the right words for the photographers. It's something essential had been hollowed out and replaced with something harder, colder, more efficient. The Navy, untroubled by philosophical questions about the psychological cost of creating efficient killers, promoted him to aviation machinist's mate 2nd class and offered him a position as a gunnery instructor at the training facility in Jacksonville, Florida. Was a plum assignment, safe and stationary, allowing him to train other gunners while remaining far from combat. Most men would have accepted immediately, grateful for the opportunity to serve without dying. Hank turned it down without hesitation and requested assignment to a combat squadron. When asked why by a puzzled personnel officer, he provided no explanation beyond a shrug and the observation that the pumps need someone who understands how they work. He flew 63 more combat missions over the next 2 years, serving aboard 3 different carriers, participating in battles at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Laddie Gulf. His final tally, according to carefully maintained records documented in the Naval Historical Center's archives, was 23 confirmed kills, 7 probables, and 14 damage numbers that placed him among the top-scoring aerial gunners in U.S. Navy history. But unlike fighter pilots whose victories were celebrated and publicized, gunners remained largely anonymous, their contributions noted in after-action reports but rarely in headlines. The war ended in August of 1945 with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Henry Garrison returned to Philadelphia in September of that year with a Navy Cross, 2 distinguished flying crosses for air medals, and a Purple Heart from a wound he'd received during the Battle of Lady Gulf when a Zero's cannon shell had shredded his left shoulder. The Navy offered him a commission and a career, promising rapid advancement for a man with his combat record and demonstrated abilities. He declined, accepted his discharge papers with the same quiet efficiency he'd applied to everything else, and returned to the Navy Yard to make pumps. His old supervisor, a man named Frank Kowalski, no relation to Ensign Michael Kowalski, though Hank never mentioned the coincidence, welcomed him back with a bear hug and genuine tears. "Heard you made quite a name for yourself," Frank said, gesturing at a newspaper clipping pinned to the workshop bulletin board, yellowed now with age, proclaiming Hank's exploits in breathless prose. "Ah!" Hank glanced at it, shrugged, and asked if his old workbench was still available. Within a week, it was as though he'd never left. His hands once again, elbow deep in pump assemblies, calibrating tolerances to within thousandths of an inch, applying the same precision and focus that had once aimed machine guns. He never spoke about the war, not to his coworkers, not to his family, not to the reporters who occasionally tracked him down seeking interviews for articles about "Where Are They Now?" pieces. When pressed, he would offer only the blandest of responses. "I did my job. We all did our jobs. That's all." The medals stayed in a drawer, unworn and unmentioned. The newspaper clippings yellowed and crumbled. The memories, those he kept locked away in a place so deep and dark that even he couldn't access them without considerable effort. He married in 1947, a woman named Dorothy Chen, who'd been Lieutenant Bobby Chen's younger sister. Bobby hadn't survived the war. He'd been killed during the Battle of the Philippines. See? When his Devastator was shot down by anti-aircraft fire butt, before his death, he'd written to his sister about the pump maker who'd saved their lives over the Coral Sea. Dorothy sought Hank out after the war, initially just to thank him, to connect with someone who'd known her brother. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony at a Philadelphia church, and if Hank woke screaming sometimes in the night, if he flinched at the sound of backfiring cars, if he sometimes stared at nothing with eyes that saw different skies, well, Dorothy understood. She'd lost people too. Everyone had lost people. They had 3 children: Robert, named for Bobby Chen, Sarah, and James. Hank taught them all the value of precision, of understanding how systems worked, of applying mechanical principles to solve problems. He taught them about pumps and engines, and the satisfaction of creating things that worked reliably, that served their purpose, that could be trusted. He never taught them about guns or war, or what happened when you applied mechanical principles to the problem of killing other human beings as efficiently as possible. Some lessons, he believed, were better left unlearned if circumstances allowed. Henry Garrison died in February of 1997 at the age of 78. His passing noted in the Philadelphia Inquirer, with a modest obituary that mentioned his wartime service in a single sentence. The funeral was well attended, his children and grandchildren, his co-workers past and present, a handful of surviving veterans from his carrier days who'd somehow heard the news. A Navy honor guard fired a 3-vol salute over his flag-draped casket, the rifle shots echoing across the cemetery in a way that made some of the older veterans flinch. Among his effects, his children found the Navy Cross in its velvet-lined case. The medal's ribbon still crisp, despite 52 years in a drawer. And they found, tucked into the back of his workshop manual for pump maintenance, a single photograph: 3 young men in flight suits, standing before a Devastator torpedo bomber, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unearned confidence of youth who haven't